Experts failed to fix ship engine until Admiral brings in genius Navy veteran. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was a typical morning at the naval dockyard, and the air was filled with the usual hustle of sailors and technicians working tirelessly to prepare the fleet. However, one particular ship had been the center of attention all day. The USS Tacoma, a formidable warship, had been in for routine maintenance, but something had gone horribly wrong. Its main engine, an essential component to its readiness, was malfunctioning. Despite the best efforts of the ship's technical team, the engine remained dead. The ship was essentially grounded, and the situation was growing more urgent by the hour. The technicians, armed with state-of-the-art diagnostic tools, had tried everything. They had run tests, rechecked connections, and consulted manuals, but the engine refused to start. Each attempt to restart the system only ended in more frustration, and time was running out. A sense of hopelessness began to settle in. The engineers were defeated. They stood around the engine bay, shaking their heads, unable to find the root of the problem. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the senior technician, Lieutenant Commander Jeffries, tried to maintain some semblance of control. He wiped the sweat from his brow, eyeing the massive machine that was now refusing to cooperate. "We've tried everything," he muttered, looking at his team. "This is a problem we can't fix with just tools and data." His voice carried the weight of defeat. That's when the Admiral walked in. Admiral Wright was a veteran of the fleet, known for his commanding presence and sharp intuition. He was a man who had seen and fixed things that others deemed impossible, but he wasn't there to supervise the repair. Instead, he had one person in mind, someone who had the skills to fix the unfixable. Without a word, the Admiral motioned to the back of the hangar. At that moment, an older man stepped forward from the shadows. His name was Eugene "Doc" Miller, a retired Navy veteran with more than 40 years of service. He had once been the go-to mechanic for some of the most complex military machines, and his reputation was legendary. His appearance was unassuming, just a man in his 60s, wearing a faded cap and a weathered jacket. But the moment he walked into the room, the tension shifted. "You all been trying to restart this thing, huh?" Doc said with a calm, almost amused tone. The technicians exchanged skeptical glances. They had no idea who this man was, or why he thought he could fix what they couldn't. But the Admiral's presence was enough to quiet any objections. With a slow, deliberate pace, Doc approached the engine, his hands moving with practiced ease, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. "Let's see what you've got," Lieutenant Commander Jeffries said, his tone dripping with doubt. But Doc didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he crouched down and examined the engine's innards with a critical eye. "This old girl is stubborn," Doc muttered under his breath, but there was a trace of affection in his voice, as though the ship was an old friend. He made a few adjustments, checking components the others had overlooked. "You can't trust new tech," Doc continued. "Sometimes, it's the little things you can't see on a screen, that make all the difference." The technician stood back, watching in disbelief as Doc worked. In mere moments, the engine, which had been silent for hours, sputtered to life. The room was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the engine slowly coming to full power. Lieutenant Commander Jeffries' jaw dropped. He turned to the Admiral, who stood with a small, knowing smile. "I should have called him in sooner," Jeffries muttered, still stunned by the turn of events. Doc stood up and wiped his hands on a rag, a modest grin on his face. "Sometimes, the old ways still work best," he said. The ship was ready to go back out to sea, and the technicians were left speechless. They had failed, but this veteran, this man who had been discarded by time, had not only fixed the engine, he had reminded them that skill and experience could never be replaced by fancy technology. The Admiral gave Doc a nod of approval, and for a brief moment, the room was filled with a deep sense of respect. The USS Tacoma was back in action, thanks to the genius of a Navy veteran who had never forgotten how to get things done the right way. The engine hummed steadily now, a sound of triumph that filled the hangar and echoed through the cavernous space. The technicians stood around, still in disbelief, their hands hanging loosely at their sides as they processed what had just happened. The USS Tacoma's main engine, which had been completely unresponsive for hours, was now purring like a well-oiled machine, thanks to the calm hands of Eugene "Doc" Miller. He wiped the oil off his hands and glanced over at the Admiral, who was watching the scene unfold with quiet approval. Doc wasn't just a mechanic. He was a legend, the kind of person you could call when the modern world's tools and technology couldn't fix what needed fixing. "All right, gentlemen, she's good to go," Doc said, his voice rough with age, but steady and confident. He didn't ask for gratitude, nor did he expect it. He had done what he came to do. "You just need to remember," he added with a sly smile, "that sometimes the new tools and gadgets just don't know how to listen to the old ones." The technicians remained silent. One of them, a young man who had been particularly vocal in his skepticism, slowly nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. "How did you know it was the—" he started, but Doc cut him off. "Experience, son," Doc said simply, wiping his hands with a rag. "I've been fixing things like this for longer than you've been alive. Experience can tell you things a screen never will." As the engineers began to work again, preparing for the ship to depart, the Admiral turned to Doc with a look of genuine respect. "I owe you one," Admiral Wright said. "Not just for fixing the engine, but for reminding these young men what real skill and knowledge look like." Doc just shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "I don't need any credit," he said. "The ship's ready, and that's what matters." The USS Tacoma was now set to resume its mission, a small miracle considering the chaos that had unfolded earlier. But as Doc turned to leave, he wasn't done just yet. There was one more thing he needed to do. "I'll be out of your hair," Doc muttered, but as he walked toward the exit, the Admiral called after him. "Doc," Admiral Wright said, his voice firm yet kind, "I want you to stay for the briefing. It's the least I can do. Your expertise, it's invaluable." Doc hesitated, then nodded. He hadn't been in a briefing room in years, not since the days when he was still part of the Navy. But he figured it wouldn't hurt to share a few more stories. The crew was about to board, and as they prepared to depart, the tension from earlier had evaporated. The young engineers were now chatting with each other, clearly processing the lesson they had just learned. They had seen firsthand the importance of experience. As Doc walked into the briefing room, he could feel the eyes of the sailors on him. There was no mistaking the quiet respect that had replaced the doubt. The Admiral had made sure that everyone knew who had fixed the engine, and more importantly, why it had worked. It wasn't about fancy gadgets or complex systems. It was about a man who had been through the toughest battles, who had learned the value of patience, precision, and the art of fixing things that no one else could. Doc took a seat at the back of the room, his hands folded in front of him, and listened as the Admiral began the briefing. The ship's mission was crucial, and the repairs had come just in time. But for the crew, there was something far more valuable that they had learned. Sometimes, the most important skills can't be measured by technology alone. As the meeting went on, Doc felt the weight of his years catch up with him, the fatigue of being a man who had seen too much. But he didn't mind. He knew he had done his part. And for him, that was enough. The meeting room had grown quiet as Admiral Wright continued to speak, detailing the ship's next mission and the tactical approach for the deployment of the USS Tacoma. But Eugene "Doc" Miller, sitting at the back of the room, was not fully focused on the briefing. He was used to the technical side of operations, the engines, the systems, the mechanics, but the political side, the command structure, was something he had left behind decades ago. Despite his reluctance, he had agreed to stay. He didn't want to be rude, but the truth was, he wasn't sure how much use his old war stories would be in a room full of professionals. His mind drifted back to the days when he had been a part of something much bigger, when the work he did had kept his comrades alive, when saving a machine wasn't just about getting it running, but about keeping the war effort alive. As the Admiral finished his briefing, he looked over at Doc, noticing that the old man's attention seemed to wander. "Doc," Admiral Wright called, breaking the silence. "Why don't you tell the crew a bit about the old days? About the real work, when machines were more than just bolts and gears, when they were the difference between life and death." Doc's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected to be called on like this, especially not in front of a room full of seasoned sailors. But there was something in the Admiral's voice, a quiet challenge, that made him stand up and walk to the front of the room. He didn't need a microphone, didn't need a podium. just his voice and the weight of his experiences. "All right," Doc began, his voice rough but clear. "You all know what it's like to trust machines. You've got your screens, your diagnostics, your fancy equipment. But back in the day, we didn't have that luxury. When a machine failed, you didn't get a readout on a computer screen telling you what was wrong. You had to listen to it, feel it, understand it like you would understand the breath of a friend." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I remember one mission back in Nam. A helicopter was hit, engine shot out. The tech said it couldn't fly. They said it was done for, that the bird was dead. But there was a pilot who wouldn't accept that. He refused to leave his crew behind. So he called me in." Doc's voice softened, his gaze distant. "I climbed onto that helicopter, covered in blood and dirt. I didn't have the fancy tools the young guys have now. But I knew that machine. I knew its rhythm, its soul, the way it moved. It didn't just need repairs, it needed trust. And we didn't have much time." The room was still, every person listening intently, caught up in the story. "I didn't fix it with the tools I had," Doc continued. "I fixed it with the tools I didn't have. The kind you can't teach in a class, the kind that comes from working under fire. I patched it up, not with a perfect repair, but with a repair that got it off the ground, got it to safety." Doc cleared his throat and looked around at the young sailors who were now hanging on his every word. "That's the kind of work we did back then. We didn't just fix machines. We kept people alive. The machines, the technology, they were tools. But the real work was knowing when to trust your instincts, when to push past the limits of the manuals and do what had to be done." There was a long pause as the sailors reflected on Doc's words. Finally, Lieutenant Commander Jeffries, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, stepped forward. "Sir, what you just said, it's something I haven't heard in a long time," he said, his voice filled with new respect. "We've gotten so caught up in the tech, the new systems, that we've forgotten what it really means to know your machine." Doc nodded slowly, as though he had expected this reaction. "It's easy to forget, son. But sometimes the newest tech is just another tool. The best tools are the ones you understand, the ones you've lived with." The room was silent for a moment, each person reflecting on the deeper meaning behind Doc's words. It was a lesson they wouldn't forget. Admiral Wright stood and clapped his hands together, breaking the silence. "All right, that's enough philosophy for today. We've got work to do." "But Doc," he said, turning to the veteran, "I think you've earned yourself a place on this ship. You've reminded us all of something important." Doc gave a small, modest smile, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. His work had spoken for him. As the meeting continued, Doc remained in the back of the room, the quiet observer. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was part of something again. The crew was ready to sail, and this time, they wouldn't just rely on the machines. They would remember what they had learned. True expertise came from the people who understood the machines. The people who knew them inside and out, just like Document. And that kind of experience, no technology could replace it. The next few days aboard the USS Tacoma were filled with a new sense of purpose. The crew had rallied together, their pride restored by the repair and the lessons learned from Doc Miller. There was a renewed focus on both the mission at hand and the bond that tied them together as a team. However, it was also clear that something deeper had shifted, something more than just technical expertise. Doc had reminded them of the power of experience, of trusting your instincts when the tech and manuals failed. It was a lesson none of them would forget. As the ship prepared to depart, the air was thick with the anticipation of the journey ahead. The crew was fully aware that their mission was critical, but they had learned that sometimes it wasn't just the engines or the equipment that made the difference. It was the people behind them. The final preparations for the ship's departure were underway when Admiral Wright called for one final gathering in the briefing room. The crew had gathered, and Doc stood at the back, his arms crossed as he surveyed the scene. It wasn't his place to speak much anymore. He had done his part. But the Admiral's call for a final briefing felt like it would bring something important to a close. "All right, crew," Admiral Wright began, his voice steady and commanding. "We're ready for the mission. But I want to take a moment to reflect on something more important." He glanced over at Doc, who was standing at the back of the room, watching with quiet observation. "I know we've been through a lot over the past few days, but I want everyone to remember the lesson we learned from Doc Miller." The room went still as the crew turned to look at the elderly veteran, standing just outside the circle of their immediate focus, but undeniably present in their thoughts. Doc taught us that, no matter how advanced our equipment gets, it's still the people who make the difference. It's not about the tools or the technology, it's about the skill and experience behind them. He's been through things none of us could imagine, and it's that kind of experience that saves lives. That's the kind of value you can't measure on a screen. The Admiral paused, allowing his words to sink in. So, as we sail out and face whatever lies ahead, I want you all to remember this. Trust in each other. Trust in the experience of your comrades, and don't let pride or arrogance get in the way of your mission. We're all in this together, and that's how we'll succeed. The crew stood in respectful silence, a new sense of unity in the air. The young sailors, once skeptical and dismissive, now looked at Doc with a newfound respect, the kind that only comes after witnessing true skill and dedication. Doc Miller didn't need accolades or applause. He didn't need to say a word. His presence, his work, had done all the talking for him. As the Admiral finished the briefing, he turned to Doc one last time. "You've done more for this ship and this crew than any of us could ever repay," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. Doc gave a simple nod. "Just doing my job," he replied, his voice gravelly but steady. The Admiral smiled, then turned back to the crew. "All right, everyone, let's get moving. We've got a mission to complete." As the crew moved to their stations, Doc slowly made his way to the engine room. He wasn't needed for anything else. The ship was ready. But there was something comforting about the steady hum of the engines, something that reminded him of the days when every engine he worked on was a lifeline, a vital part of something much bigger. It had been years since Doc had been on a ship like this, years since he had worked alongside a crew of men and women who relied on him. But now, as he walked through the ship, he realized that while the world had changed, some things stayed the same. The machines might get more complex, the tools might get sharper, but at the end of the day, it was the people like him, who made the difference. As the USS Tacoma set sail, cutting through the water with a purpose, Doc Miller stood at the edge of the deck, looking out over the horizon. The ship was more than just a vessel of steel and machinery. It was a testament to the men and women who worked on it, who kept it running, and who made sure it would always stay afloat, no matter what. The sound of the engines below was a reminder of everything that had been done to keep this ship and the people aboard it alive. And as Doc stood there, watching the water rush past, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that once again, he had done his part. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was for sure: this crew was ready. And with Doc Miller on their side, there was no challenge they couldn't overcome. As the USS Tacoma sailed through the open waters, the crew was finally beginning to settle into a new rhythm. The atmosphere aboard the ship had shifted, subtly but undeniably. The engineers, who had once been dismissive of the older methods, now approached their tasks with a renewed sense of purpose. The ship's systems were humming along smoothly, but the real change was in the way the crew worked together. Doc Miller's brief stay on board had planted a seed that was growing slowly but surely, bringing a deeper understanding of not just how to fix a machine, but how to keep it alive, how to make it part of the crew. Doc was not someone who liked to be in the spotlight, but there was no ignoring the quiet respect he had earned. He continued his routine of quietly wandering through the ship, checking engines, inspecting equipment, offering advice to anyone who asked. He was in his element here, with machines, with people who trusted him. The young sailors and officers who had once seen him as nothing more than a relic now saw him as a living testament to the hard-won wisdom that could only come from years of experience. It was a strange feeling for Document. He had spent decades working on machines, saving lives in quiet, unsung ways. But this, the recognition, the camaraderie, this was new. As the days went by, he found himself more and more at ease, his place on the ship becoming less about the work and more about the people. The crew had learned from him, and in turn, he had learned from them. The way they approached problems, the way they shared ideas, it reminded him that no matter how old or worn a person became, they could still make a difference. One afternoon, as the ship cruised steadily through the Pacific, the routine was interrupted by an unexpected signal. The radar operators on duty had picked up an unidentifiable vessel on the horizon, moving fast and on a direct course toward the USS Tacoma. The crew sprang into action. The ship was still in the early stages of its mission, and though they weren't in hostile waters, it was better to be safe than sorry. Admiral Wright immediately called for a briefing. Doc, of course, was there, sitting at the back of the room, as always, but now, instead of being a mere observer, he felt the weight of his own experience pulling him forward. The atmosphere was tense. The crew had trained for combat situations, but the uncertainty of this unknown vessel was a reminder that anything could happen out at sea. The radar operators provided updates every few minutes, but the ship's course and intentions remained unclear. "We'll need to stay vigilant," Admiral Wright said, his voice steady as he addressed the crew. "Prepare for any scenario. We don't know what we're dealing with, but we will not be caught off guard." As the meeting ended, Admiral Wright approached Document. "I need your advice," he said quietly. "We're in unknown waters, and I know you've seen more situations like this than anyone here. What do you think?" Doc met the Admiral's gaze, a long pause before he responded. "It's simple. Trust your instincts. Machines don't always tell you everything you need to know, but they'll tell you enough if you listen. And if things go south, trust the crew. They've got your back." The Admiral nodded, appreciating the straightforwardness of the advice. "Thanks, Document. I'll make sure the crew hears that." As the ship prepared to change course and approach the unknown vessel, the crew tightened up. They knew what they had to do, and they knew that their veteran was there, watching over them. A reminder that experience, true experience, was an invaluable asset in times of uncertainty. The hours passed with no new developments, and soon the unidentifiable vessel turned and veered off course, disappearing into the horizon as quickly as it had appeared. It was a false alarm, but the crew was shaken. They had all learned something important from the situation. The machinery, the radar, the weapons, all of it had worked as expected, but it was the calm leadership of the Admiral and the steady presence of Doc Miller that had kept the crew grounded. As the Tacoma sailed onward, the horizon stretched before them, calm once again. Doc stood at the edge of the deck, looking out over the vast ocean. The sea was unpredictable, but so were the people he had come to respect. For the first time in years, Doc felt a sense of belonging again. He wasn't just fixing machines. He was helping to steer the ship, guiding the next generation of sailors through calm and storm alike. And as he looked out at the endless blue, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. The crew had learned from him, and now, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, with or without the machines that had once seemed so crucial. They had the knowledge, the respect, and the experience to see it through. The days that followed were quiet but tense. The USS Tacoma, having passed through the near miss with the unidentifiable vessel, continued on its mission. The crew had regained their rhythm, and there was a sense of unspoken pride that seemed to fill the air. They were more than just a team. They were a family, and they had learned from each other. But even as the ship cut through the open waters, there was still a sense of uncertainty about what lay ahead. Doc Miller, though somewhat out of place in the modernized world of naval operations, felt more connected to the crew than he had in years. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was part of something. His quiet presence aboard the ship had done something far more profound than just fixing the engine or giving sage advice. It had instilled a sense of duty and respect in the young sailors. They saw in him the embodiment of a different kind of strength, the kind that didn't require recognition or applause. It was the strength of experience, the kind earned through years of service, the kind that didn't come with medals or accolades, but with the silent acknowledgement of those who truly understood the value of service. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a deep orange, Doc found himself on the deck again, looking out over the horizon. The ship was sailing steadily, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. This wasn't his ship, and it wasn't his crew, but for the first time in years, it felt like home. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, the sound of footsteps behind him broke the silence. He turned to see Admiral Wright walking toward him. "You're up here often," the Admiral said with a smile. "I'm just taking in the view," Doc replied with a small grin. "You've been a part of this ship's journey for longer than you think." The Admiral's tone was serious, but there was an underlying note of respect in his voice. Doc gave a slight nod, but he didn't reply right away. He wasn't one for long speeches or grand declarations. His actions had spoken for him already. The Admiral continued, "I've been meaning to thank you again. The crew, they're different now. You've given them something that no one else could have." Doc shook his head slightly. "I'm just a mechanic, Admiral. he said simply. You know that. The Admiral paused, his expression thoughtful. You might be a mechanic, but what you've taught them is something much bigger. You've reminded them what it means to be part of something. To serve. To be more than just the machines they work on. Doc didn't know how to respond to that. He had never thought of himself as a teacher, but as he looked out over the ship and the horizon beyond, he realized the Admiral was right. What he had done was more than just fix an engine or share a few war stories. He had reminded them that their work had meaning, that it wasn't just about the tools they used, but the people they worked with. We've got a mission ahead of us, Admiral Wright said, breaking the silence. And I'm confident we're ready for it. But I wanted you to know, what you've done here, it's going to stay with these men and women long after we've completed this mission. Doc nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. The sky was turning darker now, and the first stars began to twinkle faintly in the vast expanse above. I did my part, Doc said quietly, and they did theirs. The Admiral clapped him on the shoulder, a rare gesture of camaraderie. We all did, he said, before turning to leave. As Doc watched him walk away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment that had eluded him for so long. The USS Tacoma had become more than just a ship to him. It had become a symbol of what he had spent his life working for. Not the machines, but the people who kept them running, the people who worked together to get the job done, no matter the odds. As the evening wore on and the stars filled the sky, Doc stayed on deck a little longer. The steady rhythm of the ship beneath his feet, the calm of the night, the crew below, all of it felt right. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a place, like he was part of something important. The ship sailed on, cutting through the water with a steady course. Doc Miller knew that no matter what came next, he had done everything he could to prepare the crew, to remind them of the value of experience, and to show them that no matter how advanced the technology, it was the people that made all the difference. As the USS Tacoma continued its journey, the ship had found a steady rhythm once more. The crew was functioning with an efficiency that spoke of newfound confidence. The engine was humming along without a hitch, the repairs from Doc Miller now nothing more than a memory, but the lessons learned from that experience were still fresh in their minds. The crew worked like a well-oiled machine, but Doc Miller, the quiet mechanic who had fixed the ship and reminded them all of the value of experience, remained at the heart of it all. He wasn't there for the accolades or the recognition. He was there because it was his duty. He had been fixing things for most of his life, but now, with this crew, he had become something more. He had become a mentor, a reminder of the importance of knowledge and respect for those who came before. The Admiral had noticed it too. As the ship moved further out into open water, preparations for the mission ahead were underway, but there was a constant undercurrent of appreciation that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about the crew and the bond they had forged together. The morning after their brief encounter with the unknown vessel, Doc was once again on deck, watching the horizon as the sun rose. The sky was clear, the air was calm, and for a moment, it seemed as though everything had fallen into place. The ship was headed into unfamiliar waters, but it no longer seemed like such a daunting task. They were ready. Doc had never been one for grand speeches, but he couldn't help but reflect on the transformation he had witnessed in the crew. Just a few days ago, they had been uncertain, hesitant in their abilities, unsure of how to approach the challenges that lay ahead. But now, they were different. They had seen the power of experience, and it had changed them. The respect that had been earned wasn't just for Doc. It was for the knowledge that experience brought with it, the lessons learned over a lifetime of trial and error, failure and success. They had learned that no machine, no technology, could replace the human element, the wisdom that could only come from years of working with things that others thought they knew. Doc had reminded them of that, and now, as the ship sailed toward its next mission, it was clear that the crew had not only gained the skills they needed to succeed, they had gained a sense of camaraderie, a bond that went beyond the ship's systems and equipment. The Admiral knew it too. He had watched as the crew responded to Doc, as they took his lessons to heart. They had stopped seeing him as an outsider, a relic from the past, and had begun to see him as a cornerstone of the team. Admiral Wright had always valued loyalty, respect, and hard work, and he knew that Doc embodied all of those qualities. He had given the crew something intangible, something that couldn't be measured on a chart or by any set of figures. As the ship sailed on, The Admiral made a point to check in on Doc every so often, always finding him where he was most comfortable, near the engines, where the hum of the ship matched the steady rhythm of his thoughts. "You know," the Admiral said one morning as he found Doc once again standing at the edge of the deck, looking out over the ocean, "you've done more for this crew than you know." Doc looked over his shoulder, his weathered face softening just a little. "I'm just doing what I've always done," he replied, his voice low and steady. "Fixing things. Making sure they work. It's more than that," Admiral Wright said, his tone serious. "You've given them a sense of purpose. They don't just fix things, they understand them. And that makes all the difference." Doc chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's all about understanding, Admiral. The machines, the crew, the mission, they all need that." The Admiral stood beside him for a moment, both of them watching the open ocean ahead. "I'll make sure they remember that," the Admiral said. "But it's not just about remembering. It's about living it every day." Doc gave a quiet nod, feeling the weight of the Admiral's words. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He had become a part of something bigger, a team, a crew, a family. They were ready for whatever lay ahead. As the USS Tacoma sailed forward, through calm seas and toward the unknown, there was a quiet sense of confidence that had taken root within the crew. They had learned to trust one another, to rely on experience as much as technology, and to know that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Doc Miller had given them that, and as the ship pushed further into the horizon, it became clear that they were more than just a crew. They were a force to be reckoned with. The days that followed aboard the USS Tacoma were filled with a sense of quiet determination. The crew, now more unified than ever, had fully embraced the lessons Doc Miller had imparted. They worked with a new sense of purpose, no longer relying solely on the latest technology, but understanding the importance of experience and collaboration. Doc, meanwhile, continued his routine, walking through the ship, checking equipment, offering advice where needed, but his role had shifted. He wasn't just the mechanic anymore. He had become a mentor, a figure of wisdom who offered guidance not just on machines, but on life aboard the ship. He was no longer the outsider, but a part of the fabric of the crew, a bridge between the past and the present. As the USS Tacoma sailed through the open sea, the crew faced another challenge. This time, it wasn't an unknown vessel on the radar or a mechanical failure, but an internal struggle. Tensions had begun to rise between two factions of the crew, those who had been on the ship for years, and the newer, younger sailors who had joined more recently. The older sailors had grown accustomed to the ship's rhythm, the way things worked, while the younger ones struggled to adapt to the pressure of life at sea. This brewing tension came to a head one evening during a routine drill. As the crew performed their exercises, one of the younger sailors, a petty officer, made a mistake that caused a minor malfunction in the ship's system. The older sailors immediately jumped on him, criticizing his lack of experience and discipline. The younger sailors, feeling belittled, pushed back. The situation escalated quickly, with harsh words exchanged and tempers flaring. The Admiral called for a meeting in the mess hall, gathering everyone together to address the issue. Doc, who had been quietly observing the tension building, was asked to attend as well. As the sailors filed into the room, the air was thick with the unsaid words and the unspoken frustration that had been building for days. Doc stood in the back, his arms folded, watching the scene unfold. Admiral Wright stepped forward, his voice commanding attention. "We have a problem," he began, his eyes sweeping over the room. "A problem that goes beyond a simple mistake or a failed drill. It's a problem of trust." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We're a crew, and we need to remember that. We rely on each other, and when one of us falters, we all do. The older sailors here have the experience, but the younger sailors have the drive and the future of this ship in their hands." The room remained silent. Doc, sensing the tension still thick in the air, took a step forward. "We've all been there," he said quietly, his voice carrying over the room. "We've all been the ones who didn't know, the ones who had to learn the hard way. I've seen it in battle. I've seen it on every ship I've worked on. And I'll tell you this, it doesn't matter how old you are, how long you've been here. What matters is that we all learn from each other. You can't just rely on the past, and you can't ignore the future." The older sailors looked at him, some of them nodding in agreement. The younger sailors, too, began to settle down, their defensiveness slowly melting away. Doc continued, his tone steady but firm. You learn by doing, by making mistakes, by getting things wrong, and fixing them. But you also learn by trusting those who've come before you. We're a team, not separate groups. If one of us falls, we all fall. But if one of us rises, we all rise. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. The Admiral nodded slowly. Doc's right, he said. We're not a collection of individuals. We are a crew, a unit. And the sooner we start acting like one, the better off we'll be. The tension in the room eased, the hostility fading into something more productive, a desire to move forward as one. The meeting concluded with a renewed sense of unity. The next day, the crew worked together seamlessly, helping each other, offering advice, and learning from the mistakes of the day before. Doc didn't need to do much. He just had to be there, quietly guiding them when needed, showing them that respect for one another was more important than anything else. As the ship continued its journey, the crew found that the unity they had built was stronger than any mechanical failure or external threat they might face. The lesson was simple, but powerful. Experience and trust in each other were the true engines of their success. The USS Tacoma was more than just a ship. It was a living, breathing entity, a team bound together by shared purpose and mutual respect. And with Doc Miller still on board, the crew knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one. The calm that had settled over the USS Tacoma after the crew's brief internal conflict was soon disrupted by the growing tensions in the region. The ship had crossed into more dangerous waters, an area where threats, whether from hostile forces or unpredictable weather, loomed just beyond the horizon. It was the kind of environment that demanded the utmost vigilance, and the crew knew it. Yet, despite the challenges, they faced these dangers as a unified team, stronger than ever, thanks to the lessons they had learned from each other, particularly from Doc Miller. Doc had become a steady presence on the ship, never demanding attention, but always offering a steady hand and the wisdom that only time could provide. But now, it was time for action. The USS Tacoma was on high alert, and its crew was preparing for what might lie ahead. They had received intelligence about an enemy vessel operating in the area, one that was known for its stealth and speed. The Admiral had called a briefing to go over the strategy. As the crew assembled, Doc quietly took his usual place at the back of the room. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was now an integral part of the ship's operations. Admiral Wright began the meeting with the gravity that came with the news. We're entering a high-risk zone, he said, his voice firm but calm. Our mission is critical, and we can't afford any mistakes. We know the enemy is out there, and we know they have the capability to remain hidden. That's why we need to be smarter, faster, and more prepared than they are. The room was silent as the crew absorbed the information. We've trained for this, the Admiral continued, his eyes sweeping across the room, making sure he had the crew's full attention. We've learned from our experiences, and now it's time to put that knowledge to work. Each of you has a role to play. Stick to the plan, trust in each other, and we'll make it through. Doc nodded silently in agreement. He knew what the Admiral meant. This wasn't just about the machines. It was about the crew, their trust in one another, and their ability to perform under pressure. After the briefing, the crew set to work. Everyone had their tasks, whether it was manning the radar, preparing the weapons, or ensuring that the ship's systems were in perfect working order. Doc was in his element, moving through the ship with ease, checking engines and making sure every component was functioning as it should. There was a quiet intensity on board. The crew worked with precision, but there was also an underlying tension. They all knew that their next move could mean the difference between life and death. Hours passed, and the ship continued its slow, calculated approach toward the enemy's known location. Doc found himself in the engine room again, just as he had when the ship first faced mechanical failure. This time, though, it wasn't about fixing a broken machine. It was about ensuring that the ship would be ready for whatever came next. As he checked the engines, a young sailor approached him. Doc, the sailor said hesitantly, I just wanted to say thank you for everything. Doc raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. What do you mean? For showing us the right way to do things. For teaching us not to rely just on the tech, but to trust our instincts. We wouldn't be ready for this without you. Doc gave a small smile, though he didn't reply right away. Just doing my job, kid, he said quietly. "We're all in this together." As the USS Tacoma neared the enemy's location, the tension reached a breaking point. The radar operators had picked up the hostile vessel, now closing in on them with alarming speed. The crew braced themselves for what was coming. The Admiral gave the order, and the ship sprang into action. The sailors moved quickly, efficiently, as they went into battle mode. Doc watched from the sidelines, his experience telling him that this was where the crew would either shine or falter. The next few hours were a blur. The enemy vessel was fast, but the USS Tacoma was faster. The two ships exchanged fire, the sound of the cannons and the hum of the engines blending together in a chaotic symphony. Doc kept his eyes on the systems, making sure everything was running smoothly. The crew followed the plan, using their training, their trust in one another, and the lessons they had learned from document. The battle seemed to go on forever, each second feeling like an eternity. But in the end, the USS Tacoma emerged victorious. The enemy vessel, outmatched and overwhelmed, retreated into the distance. The crew cheered, the tension breaking as they realized they had survived the fight. The Admiral approached Doc, his face a mixture of relief and pride. "We did it," he said. "And we did it because we trusted each other. Because we remembered what we've learned, and because we had the right people in place. I couldn't have asked for a better crew." Doc simply nodded, a quiet pride in his heart. He had done his part, just as he always had. But this time, it wasn't just about fixing machines. It was about fixing something bigger. The crew had come together, not just as a team, but as a family. And now, as they sailed on toward their next mission, Doc knew they were ready for whatever came next. The USS Tacoma had crossed into a new phase of its journey, with the crew now stronger and more united than ever. The recent battle had been a turning point for the sailors, and the lessons learned from their experience, especially from Doc Miller, had instilled a sense of pride and purpose in each of them. But despite the victory, the calm after the storm was only temporary. The waters ahead were still uncharted, and the crew knew there would be more challenges on the horizon. The ship continued its journey, moving deeper into unfamiliar territory, and the crew stood vigilant, knowing they had to be prepared for anything. Doc Miller, ever the quiet observer, continued his daily routines. He didn't need to be in the spotlight, didn't need the accolades. His satisfaction came from seeing the younger sailors applying the lessons he had taught them, from watching them grow into capable and confident individuals. Doc's role had shifted from just fixing things to being a guiding presence, a mentor who had helped shape the crew into something more than just a team. They were a unit, bound together by trust and respect. One morning, as the ship sailed smoothly through the waters, a new challenge presented itself. The USS Tacoma had received a distress signal from a nearby vessel, a commercial freighter in distress, stranded due to engine failure in the middle of a storm. The Admiral immediately called a meeting. The crew had dealt with combat, they had faced the unknown, but this was a different kind of challenge. The ship's systems were functional, but a rescue mission meant working under pressure, with limited time, and facing the dangers of the unpredictable weather. "We've got a job to do," Admiral Wright said, addressing the crew. "Our mission is clear. We need to get that freighter to safety. But we can't afford any mistakes. We've trained for this, and now it's time to put everything we've learned into practice. We're going to work fast, and we're going to work together. And I have no doubt we can do this." Doc Miller, standing quietly at the back of the room, didn't need to be asked to step up. He had already seen the problem in his mind. He knew what needed to be done. The crew quickly mobilized. The engineers worked to prepare the tow lines and necessary equipment, while the sailors manned the radar and prepared the ship for any possible challenges. Doc was in his element again, walking through the ship, checking systems, and giving advice where needed. The storm was coming in fast, and the freighter was drifting closer to a rocky shoal. It was a race against time. As the freighter came into view, the wind began to pick up, the waves crashing against the ship as the storm rolled in. The crew was moving quickly, but the pressure was mounting. The freighter's crew was panicking, and the uncertainty of the situation only made things more tense. "We've got this," Doc said quietly to a young technician who was looking worriedly at the approaching storm. "We've done harder things than this." The technician nodded, a sense of reassurance in his eyes. Doc's calm presence was contagious. The USS Tacoma moved into position, preparing to assist the distressed vessel. The crew worked together seamlessly, each person performing their task with precision. Doc remained close by, making sure the engines were running at optimal power, ready for anything that might go wrong. As the tow lines were secured and the freighter's crew began to calm down, the storm hit with full force. The ship rocked violently, and the wind howled as the waves crashed around them. The crew held steady, trusting each other, working together with the same rhythm they had learned during the previous battle. The freighter was now tethered securely to the USS Tacoma, but the storm was making it nearly impossible to navigate safely. The seas were treacherous, and the visibility was almost zero. It was then that the crew realized just how much they had learned from Document. It wasn't just about the machines. It was about understanding how to read a situation, how to think on your feet, and how to trust your instincts. Doc had taught them that. As the storm raged on, the USS Tacoma's crew worked tirelessly to keep the freighter in tow, using their skills to navigate the treacherous waters and keep everyone safe. Doc didn't speak much during the operation. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. He moved quietly through the ship, always checking the systems, always ensuring that the crew had everything they needed. The storm finally began to subside, and the ship's lights pierced the gloom of the darkened sky. The freighter was safe, and the crew had completed the rescue. As the USS Tacoma pulled alongside the freighter and the tow lines were released, the crew let out a collective breath of relief. They had done it, and they had done it together. The Admiral approached Doc as the crew began to celebrate their success. "You've taught them well," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "This crew, this ship, is ready for anything." Doc gave a small smile. "They did it themselves," he said quietly. "I just showed them the way." As the storm finally passed and the crew began to settle in, Doc stood once again at the edge of the deck, looking out over the calm sea. The crew had learned a valuable lesson that day. They had faced the storm, both literal and figurative, and had come out stronger for it. They were no longer just a crew. They were a family, ready for whatever came next. The USS Tacoma continued its journey through the open sea, the aftermath of the storm slowly fading into the distance. The freighter they had rescued was now safely on its way, and the crew, though tired, was in high spirits. The operation had gone smoothly, a testament to their training, teamwork, and the invaluable guidance they had received from Doc Miller. The lessons learned from the storm, from the rescue mission, were fresh in their minds. They had faced an unexpected challenge, and they had handled it with precision and confidence. As the crew settled back into their routine, Doc found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. It had been years since he had been part of something like this, a team that relied on each other, that trusted each other, and that understood the value of experience. He wasn't just fixing engines anymore. He was shaping the next generation of sailors. He had done his part, and now, he watched as the crew continued to grow. The Admiral, too, had noticed the change. The respect that Doc had earned from the crew was something more than just admiration for his skills. It was a recognition of the importance of wisdom, of knowing when to listen and when to act. Admiral Wright approached Doc one afternoon as the ship cruised steadily toward its next mission. "Doc," the Admiral began, his tone serious but with a hint of appreciation, "I've been thinking a lot about what you've done for this crew. The way you've taught them, the way you've helped them grow." Doc glanced at him, raising an eyebrow, as though unsure where the conversation was headed. "I've just been doing my job," he replied, his voice low, modest. "I know," Admiral Wright said with a small smile. "But it's more than that. You've given them something they didn't know they needed. You've helped them see the bigger picture. It's not just about fixing engines or following orders. It's about understanding the people you're working with, about trusting each other, about respecting the experience that comes with time." Doc shifted slightly, feeling a sense of discomfort with the praise. He wasn't one for accolades or attention. "I'm not the one who's done all the work," Doc replied. "The crew, they've done just as much, if not more." The Admiral nodded. "That's true, but you were the catalyst. You were the one who made them realize what they're capable of. And for that, you deserve more than just thanks. You've earned the respect of every sailor on this ship." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was silence between them. Doc wasn't used to being the focus of admiration, but as he looked at the Admiral, he realized that maybe, just this once, he had earned it. The crew, the ship, the mission, they were all part of something much bigger than any one person. And for the first time in a long time, Doc felt like he was part of that. The rest of the day passed quietly, with the crew focused on their tasks. The ship moved steadily forward, toward the next challenge. As the evening set in, Doc found himself on deck once again, watching the sunset as it painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. The ship was heading into new waters, but Doc knew that the crew was ready. They had learned the lessons they needed to learn, and now, they were a stronger unit because of it. As he stood there, the wind gently tugging at his jacket, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. He wasn't just fixing engines anymore. He was helping to shape the future of the Navy, one sailor at a time. The Admiral had been right. It wasn't about the machines or the tools, it was about the people. And Doc had done his part to help them see that. As the night fell and the stars began to twinkle above, Doc remained on deck for a while longer. The ship was moving forward, but so was he. For the first time in years, he felt like he had found his place again, not just on the ship, but in the world. The USS Tacoma was more than just a vessel. It was a family, and he was a part of it. And with that thought, he finally turned and walked back inside, ready for whatever the next day might bring. As the days passed aboard the USS Tacoma, the crew found themselves settling into a steady rhythm. The ship sailed through calm waters, and the weather was favorable, allowing them to focus on their ongoing mission. However, even in the calmest moments, there was an underlying tension, the knowledge that their journey was far from over. The USS Tacoma was heading into more dangerous territory, and the crew remained vigilant, ready for whatever challenges might arise. Doc Miller, now fully integrated into the team, moved through the ship with a sense of purpose that was impossible to miss. His presence was no longer just a comforting constant. He had become a symbol of resilience and wisdom. The younger sailors who had once been hesitant to take his advice were now seeking him out, eager to learn from his wealth of experience. Doc had not just taught them how to repair engines or fix machines. He had shown them the value of patience, of understanding, and of knowing when to trust their instincts. One evening, as the ship continued its journey, Admiral Wright called Doc into his office. The Admiral had been a steady presence throughout the mission, his leadership guiding the crew through rough patches. But even he knew that the ship's journey was about to take a turn. As Doc entered the Admiral's quarters, he was greeted with a nod. The room was dimly lit, the only sounds the soft hum of the ship's systems in the background. "Doc," Admiral Wright began, his voice low but serious, "I need to talk to you about something." Doc raised an eyebrow but remained silent, his arms folded across his chest. "We've received intelligence," the Admiral continued, "about a potential threat. There's a pirate vessel operating in the waters ahead, and they're known for targeting military ships. We'll need to be ready for a confrontation." Doc didn't react immediately. He had seen it all before: pirates, hostile forces, the unpredictability of the sea. But the calmness of the Admiral's demeanor told him that this wasn't just another routine mission. "What's the plan?" Doc asked simply. The Admiral's gaze was steady. "We'll continue our course, but we'll be taking extra precautions. We'll need to be ready for anything, and I want you to stay on top of the ship's systems. We can't afford any failures if things go south." Doc nodded. "Understood," he said, his voice calm and assured. "I'll make sure everything's running smoothly." As Doc left the Admiral's office, he couldn't help but feel a familiar sense of anticipation. It wasn't the first time he had been called into a tense situation, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But there was something about this crew, about this ship, that made him believe they were ready for whatever lay ahead. The days that followed were filled with preparations. The crew was on edge, but there was also a sense of determination. They had learned from their past encounters, and they were ready to face whatever came next. Doc spent most of his time in the engine room, making sure the systems were functioning perfectly. The younger engineers came to him with questions, seeking his guidance, and Doc gave it freely. He knew that this was a critical moment for the crew, and he needed them to be at their best. As the ship sailed closer to the area where the pirate vessel was reported to be, the crew gathered in the mess hall for a final briefing. The tension was palpable, but the Admiral's voice was steady and confident. "We don't know when we'll encounter them," the Admiral said, "but we do know that we've prepared. We've trained, we've learned, and we've become a stronger team. I'm confident in all of you, and I know we'll handle this the same way we've handled everything else, together." The crew nodded, their resolve hardening. They were ready. Doc stood in the back, his eyes scanning the room. He could feel the change in them. They were no longer just a collection of individuals. They were a unit, a team that had learned how to trust each other and work together. As the briefing concluded, the crew dispersed, each member returning to their post, ready for the task ahead. Doc made his way to the bridge, checking in on the systems one last time before they entered the dangerous waters ahead. The night was falling, and the ship cut through the darkening ocean with a steady, unwavering course. It was then that the radar operator's voice cut through the silence. "Sir, we've got a contact," he said, his tone sharp. "It's the pirate vessel. They're closing in fast." The crew sprang into action, their training kicking in as they prepared for the impending confrontation. Doc didn't flinch. He knew what needed to be done. The ship's systems were ready, the crew was ready, and they had one advantage, their unity. The pirate vessel, a dark silhouette against the night, grew closer, its intentions clear. The USS Tacoma stood its ground, the crew braced for impact, knowing that they would face this challenge together. Doc stood near the engine room, ready for anything. He wasn't the one to lead the charge, but he was the one who ensured the ship would stay afloat, no matter what happened next. As the battle loomed ahead, Doc Miller, the quiet mechanic who had become so much more, knew one thing for sure. The crew was ready. They had learned to trust each other, and together, they would face whatever came next. The pirate vessel loomed closer in the distance, its silhouette sharp against the dark ocean. The USS Tacoma held its ground, the crew bracing for what was to come. Doc Miller stood near the engine room, his hands steady, knowing that his job was far from over. His years of experience had taught him how to handle moments like this, how to stay calm, how to trust in the machine, and most importantly, how to trust in the people around him. The alarms rang through the ship, signaling the imminent threat, but there was no panic in the crew's eyes. They had been through a lot together, and this was just another challenge to face as a team. "Prepare for battle stations," Admiral Wright's voice echoed over the intercom. "This is it. Stay sharp." The crew moved quickly, their movements synchronized, a well-oiled machine in motion. Doc took a moment to look around, observing the focused faces of the young sailors who had, just a few weeks ago, been unsure of their roles. Now, they stood tall, ready for whatever was coming. The pirate vessel was now only a few miles away, its weapons trained. On the USS Tacoma, the situation was dire, but the crew was more than prepared. Doc's eyes briefly met the radar operators. A silent understanding passed between them. The ship's systems were intact. They were ready. The battle began with a deafening roar as the first volley of cannon fire erupted from the pirate vessel. The USS Tacoma returned fire immediately, the sound of artillery shaking the hull of the ship. Doc remained in the engine room, listening carefully for any signs of malfunction, his hands instinctively moving over the controls, ensuring everything ran smoothly. He had trained for situations like this his entire life. Every machine, every engine, every part of the ship was his responsibility. And today, that responsibility would make all the difference. The battle raged on, each ship exchanging fire in a violent dance of cannon shots and evasive maneuvers. Doc's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the chaos above deck, but below, the engines hummed with power. The crew was working as one unit, each person doing their part, from the officers to the engineers to the sailors manning the guns. Time seemed to slow, and yet, the seconds felt like hours. The pirate vessel continued to push forward, but the USS Tacoma was faster, more agile, and better prepared. With every shot fired, Doc could hear the hum of the ship's systems, the heartbeat of the machine that kept them moving forward. Suddenly, there was a violent shudder, and the ship's systems momentarily faltered. A look of concern flashed across the technician's face, but Doc was already there, his hand moving instinctively over the controls, stabilizing the system before it could fail completely. "We're good," he said, his voice steady. The technician nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and relief. The battle continued, the pirate vessel now retreating, its fire becoming less frequent as the USS Tacoma pressed the advantage. The crew was relentless, their confidence in each other growing with every moment. The pirate ship had underestimated them. They had underestimated the crew that Doc Miller had helped to forge, one built on trust, experience, and teamwork. As the pirate vessel began to pull away, Admiral Wright gave the order to cease fire. The threat had been neutralized. The USS Tacoma had won. The crew let out a collective breath, their adrenaline slowly fading as the battle came to an end. Doc watched as the crew celebrated, their cheers filling the air, but he stayed where he was, his focus still on the ship's systems, ensuring everything was running smoothly. He wasn't one for the spotlight, and the satisfaction of a job well done was enough for him. Admiral Wright came down to the engine room, his face a picture of pride. "Well done, Doc," he said, his voice filled with respect. "You kept this ship running, and because of that, we made it through." Doc nodded, his eyes scanning the systems one last time. "It's just what we do," he replied quietly. The Admiral placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than that. You've made sure that we're not just a ship, but a crew that can face anything together. You've helped us become a family." Doc didn't respond. He didn't need to. The battle was over, the threat was gone, and the crew was stronger than ever. As the USS Tacoma sailed on, Doc Miller remained in the background, doing what he did best, making sure the ship was ready for whatever came next. He had no desire for accolades or praise. His reward was knowing that the crew had learned what it meant to trust in one another, to rely on experience, and to face any challenge as one unit. The USS Tacoma sailed into the horizon, the calm waters stretching out before them. Whatever came next, Doc knew they were ready. The crew had proven it, and he had played his part. The ship, the crew, and the experience had come together, stronger than ever. This emotional story takes you on a gripping journey aboard the USS Tacoma, a ship where a crew of sailors faces both external threats and internal challenges, all while learning to trust in each other's abilities and experience. At the heart of this emotional story is Doc Miller, a seasoned Navy veteran whose wisdom and steady hand guide the crew through difficult situations. From mechanical failures to life-or-death rescue missions, Doc helps the crew navigate every obstacle they face, teaching them the true meaning of teamwork and trust. As tensions rise, the crew's bond strengthens, proving that no challenge is too great when they face it together. This emotional story explores themes of resilience, unity, and the power of experience in overcoming adversity. Doc Miller's quiet leadership becomes the foundation that holds the USS Tacoma together, ensuring that the crew not only survives but thrives, learning valuable lessons along the way. The USS Tacoma's journey is filled with moments that highlight the importance of connection and teamwork, making this an emotional story that resonates with anyone who values the power of human strength in the face of challenges. Join the crew on their unforgettable adventure and experience the emotional story that unfolds as they confront danger and discover their true potential.